Yeah, well, his book is filled less with uh well, there is some theory in there, but the one I read is very much like there's a lot of specifics and concretes, but in a way that's it's different from anything else I've read. Like I said, tried to read Ariel Durant, and you're just
Mhm.
loaded with so many facts, and there's not one that, like, among all the facts for any given culture you learn about, there doesn't really seem to be one that stands out. Like they're all flat. Um,
Yeah.
whereas his are not flat. Like there's a hierarchy to the facts, which you then
Mhm.
you only have to learn a certain amount of facts. Anyway, I don't need to go too deeply into that, but
Yeah.
so I read I started reading through and skimming Mortimer Adler's introduction to Aristotle,
Mhm.
just simply because he's got a Kindle edition available.
Yeah.
And I read it and I'm like, what the hell? This is there's so many similarities to Rand. It's almost this. I could almost say he is the base because
Mhm.
I, except I don't know if I would have been necessarily sold or attracted to reading him, given how dense he is, if it wasn't,
Right.
say, for reading the fiction, Rand's fiction first, right?
Mhm.
So, what are your thoughts on, like, is it the case that she's almost just, it's obviously that wasn't the intention of writing the fiction, but like she's almost serving as philosophical market. She's like she was on a philosophical marketing campaign for Aristotle.
Incidentally, yeah, I think that's a consequence of it. Just the way of thinking is pretty Aristotelian, and it's just bound to be noticed. Like even if she didn't mention his name, I think anyone could notice. Anyone who studied Aristotle enough would notice her influence from him,
Right.
what she got from him, more than any other influence she may have gotten. Like she definitely has other influences, and some she didn't even want to acknowledge. But even if she didn't acknowledge Aristotle, I think you could easily tell strands of it that for sure, especially about perception, especially about reason and ethics, some of politics, definitely aesthetics, a lot of epistemology,
When I
most of
read
it
the
metaphysics.
when I read the summarized when I'm reading the summaries though, it's not even a little bit of. It's like massive, significant overlaps that are
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same.
Yeah,
She may have refined certain points, but yeah, we'll
yeah,
get to this. Like what I've summarized, I'm like, what the hell is the? I mean, I can see maybe she's kind of reworked certain answers, but like it's the same.
yeah.
I'll
A
show you
lot
when
of it
we.
is, as I can tell, especially her more formalized philosophy. Like beginning at the Fountainhead might not be as obvious, but in her mature years, especially at this drug, like by then it's like culminating into Aristotelianism, I think.
Right. Why was he so unpopular relative to Plato? Do you think it has something to do with the difficulty of his text? Because I know he's just got the lecture notes left, right? And we don't have
Christianity
his.
is why. I think
Sorry.
Christianity is why. Well, early on, Aristotle wasn't necessarily. Many Greeks did acknowledge how great of a mind he was, but I guess people had issues with him. I'm not sure exactly. Like he wasn't necessarily like super duper popular. I think when he was alive as a philosopher per se, but he did well for himself. People knew him. I guess people in Greece really did respect him, but I'm not sure to what extent his ideas really lasted in Greece. It's hard to say. It's arguable. I mean, Plato and Aristotle pretty much. His school like developed until maybe like another 100, 200 years. And Plato's school like lasted a while too. And I think Christianity started to take hold more and is more compatible with Platonism. That even Platonic thoughts are more compatible. If you're gonna put it into a new modern context, when Christianity came about, like Christianity is the perfect vehicle. So you develop Neoplatonism out of that, which usually combines a lot of Platonic ideas and Christian ideas. And you get Neoplatonism and you build from there. And obviously the history of Christianity, you can see that Plato would be like a foundation to very much of the history of the West after the Roman Empire. Like after like 200 AD, you could really notice. And from there, it's just, I mean, the collapse of the Roman Empire and that distribution of ideas was just relatively ruinous. So it's kind of hard to say what happened after that until maybe like 1300s. Like Aquinas took an interest in Aristotle. I don't know why, but he did. And he put a lot of attention to Aristotle, and he made a new popularity to Aristotle. That people started to pay attention again to Aristotle and less about Plato, even in the context of Christianity. You know, obviously he's Saint Thomas Aquinas, so he's really, really Christian. But even he was like all in Aristotle. He read all his book, analyzed all the books, like really into Aristotle, kind of making it theological and mystical for some aspects. But basically, he kept religion as religion. The secular was still stays secular. And so that changed a lot of perceptions of Aristotle. And he became widely popular after that, I think within scholastic traditions. And in the Renaissance too, his sort of ideas seem to gain more respect. And even the development of, and that's why you have Bacon developing his ideas, which is basically straight from Aristotle. Like he called it the new organon, just because like, oh, just like saying the organon too, Aristotle did the rest.
Is it the case that you talked, so Neoplatonism was alongside Christianity?
Yeah.
It was developed with Christianity?
Basically, yes.
But initially, so Plato was more popular, maybe because he'd been around for longer, but
Probably.
I like Plato's texts are enjoyable to read, like his dialogues, like Euthyphro and I haven't read out. Well, what else have I read? Well, I know there's dialogues in there generally, like they read well, they're entertaining, but Aristotle, he doesn't really have that, does he? And so you're just launching straight into the
He probably
contrapositives.
did. We just don't have them anymore.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Like I
Yeah.
wondered if it
Oh,
was
yeah.
like because of that they were lost and burnt, whatever
Yeah.
whatever the Christians did to them.
It's
That
hard
it's
to
just
say.
hard to then get into it.
Yeah. I mean, that might be part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, not to mention like Plato maybe at a better school or more popular school and
Right.
maybe had more, well, we could speculate forever why it initially started that way, but we can say for sure that the development of Christianity further emphasized Platonic ideas, and it grew from there. And Aristotle had to go through Aquinas to get really attention again. And I mean, Aristotle has a weird history about his thinking, but it is profound within, especially with related to like ideas about science coming back, because Aristotle is really all about science, essentially.
I think so reading the summary, I think I realized, okay, I can see you mentioned this, I'm pretty sure, the value of reading the original thinker, which is like the summary is good that I'm reading. It's a great summary and it covers a lot. And I like the way they've divided his thinking up into different dimensions, which I will explain in a minute. But I can't follow the reasoning process. I don't like it's somewhat imitated. Like he's explaining how he reaches certain conclusions, but I'm not sure if it's the same as reading the original. And I think it's what you said, right? Like the reason you would study an original thinker, even though a lot of what they're saying is outdated or some things may be wrong, you're reading the original purely for the method to see what their process of reasoning is and then try emulate the aspects of that method that you think are good. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, especially Aristotle, since that is kind of his way of thinking, that like he is all about the method, like even talking about like what science should be or what we call science now, what that's sort of method of thinking. I mean, he's just talking about method the whole time. That is his
Right.
way of thinking. So
Okay.
it feeds off itself, I guess.
So it's the even though the text may be difficult and outdated, the reward is seeing the method, which you can't really get from someone
Yeah.
else, right? Like you can't just
Right.
emulate only in the, you can get it in the abstract, but you
Yeah.
can't get the original.
Yeah.
Okay.
Within Aristotle, sometimes it's the translation that could affect how well you follow it. I mean, there is a translation I like, but it's hard to follow. But it's more like, well, it just depends what you're trying to learn from that particular work. Some works are easier to read than others. I mean, as I always say, metaphysics is considerably difficult to read. Nicomachean Ethics isn't too bad.
The
And there's
summarize.
less wrong to say about Nicomachean Ethics than, say, History of Animals. There's a lot to say is wrong History of Animals, but the method even there is interesting,
Right.
even if some facts are weird or wrong, like he says an elephant's trunk is, I think, just made out of fat, which is kind of accurate, but kind of not.
Yeah.
But it's not like wrong. He probably only saw like one elephant in his life, for all I know.
Mortimer Adler divides his thinking. Well, he says that Aristotle considers man to have like his activities can be divided across 3 dimensions. So making, which I've translated to production,
Mm-hmm.
doing,
Mm-hmm.
which I've translated to ethics. It's like ethical questions, and then knowing, which is learning and related to epistemology. But in all 3 of those dimensions, he's a thinker. But the kind of thinking, when you think about the like production or ethics or learning, is different. And so he then says 3 values pertaining to these 3 dimensions are truth, good, and beautiful. What do you think of that? Is that accurate, like an accurate division of his ideas?
Did you write that, or is that you summarizing, or
That's me
what was?
summarizing the way Mortimer Adler has divided his thinking. He's actually divided his chapters this way into man the maker, man the doer, man the knower, and then that's how he divides Aristotle's thinking.
I don't really agree
Okay,
with
that's
that
right.
phrasing. Yeah, but then there's also the aspect of Aristotle where he does think contemplation in and of itself is the most valuable activity to spend your time on, which is not like a practical activity. So there is a distinction within Aristotle, which might be the only thing wrong with him, actually, is that he puts a lot of value on contemplation in and of
Right.
itself,
Right.
like almost above like these more grounded actions. But there's a lot to say about Aristotle that you wouldn't even just say is he's only about contemplation. Like it might be just a matter of, like, in the grand scheme of things, as hierarchy of value, you could argue that the contemplative aspect of man's life is the most important because it's conceptual. I mean, that's a take on Aristotle that you could put a modern spin on his thinking that you could argue that it's not actually bad, but Aristotle did distinguish between the world of life of contemplation from the more physical or like arts, the things you do that are unique to the context and situation.
It's more understandable back then.
Yeah.
He was onto something, right? Like using
Yeah.
the mind, and the
Yes.
difference between man and the animals is that aspect.
Yes.
And so in order to fulfill our nature, we use the mind and so on. But it's even
Yeah.
the case now that, for example, like there are, like in cosmology, you might do some research, but it's not clear. Like you don't know in advance there may be no specific practical application that you know of. Like it's a process of gaining knowledge. And in a sense, maybe 50 years from now, someone will find a use for it and make connections between some discoveries in cosmology and other
Yeah.
fields. But for now, like you don't know. And so you can't get funding for it now. Let's say it's difficult unless you fake
Yeah.
some practical application. But back then it would have been similar, right? Like basically every field was just beginning to develop. And so you don't know that maths is going to really be helpful for anything, or
Yeah.
I don't know, other fields. It's so for him, I guess what is he left with to advocate? Like if you can't see the practical application, but it's pleasurable to pursue, then I don't know how else you come up, like it's hard to then, it would be hard to basically make the point, oh yeah, this eventually ends up with practical application.
Yeah. Yeah. In that context, it could make sense. And where there's arguments you could make about it that Aristotle may have not been totally like a mystic in that sense. Like it might just be the way we are conceiving of what he's saying, because it's hard to put it in those ancient Greek terms. We
Right.
want to put it in terms of what we've learned through how Western civilization has developed, through maybe the Christianity, a way we've been taught to think about good and evil and things like that, or even just anything we've been taught, or certain dichotomies we bought into as we've grown older that Aristotle was not even aware of. So I mean, sometimes you could even say that sometimes what he said just has to be seen in a different light entirely. That you have to imagine yourself in 300 BC, where there's no such thing as Christianity. There's no such thing as a mind-body dichotomy. There is no such thing as like an altruistic morality permeating the cultures. Like there's a profound difference in the way you live then and now, that even the way we speak might even be profoundly different. That sometimes it's hard to understand what exactly do they mean. Even Plato
Yeah.
would be different than we would imagine,
Right.
because he's not like, he didn't make Christianity, and Christianity probably distorted his ideas to an extent.
Right. Like Nietzsche's sister distorted Nietzsche's ideas apparently
Yes.
to her own
Yes.
purposes.
Yes.
Okay,
Very
so
much so.
here's my summary. I ended up, because I was writing this just before the session, the ethics I ended up just doing in dot points. I'll talk about that. But so far what I've got is this, which is, yeah, it's like the same as objectivism basically.
Mhm. What's that word that you're covering there?
Which one?
Characteristics?
Where?
Not every man is in man's. Not every, no, character is.
This is like, even the epistemology is like, I was like, this is the same. There's almost like, in terms of like all the differences are small, minor differences as far as I can tell.
Yeah, there's some things that I could mention that's like with more technical. You could see it's like, well, I see the difference now, but it is connected to Rand. Like this is more realistic than a lot of other things. Like he did understand like differentiation. He had that idea for sure.
Right.
But the other things are like integration, other things like that. He was measurement and mission. Like he was pretty much missing that. And those
Right.
are significant for objectivism.
Yeah.
But the foundations there is like, is perceptual based. It's about differentiation. That's the similarity, and that's where there's a lot of value.
Yeah, exactly. The foundations, like I read about, he even comes to conclude that sensations are the input, the mind is like a process, and the ideas are the output, which is like, that's same thing. If we're talking about it in big picture.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like I don't exactly know the quote you're thinking of or what Mortimer Adler said exactly, but
I've got it here. We can look at it later.
okay.
But like, there's so much that
Yeah.
I looked at. I was like, this is the same. And then
Yeah.
ethics, he
Yeah,
even
that
makes the
looks
point.
good. Yeah, I would agree with most of this.
He even makes the point, like there's no, the unexamined life is not worth living, but you can only examine your life if there's some end to which you're living. That is, you have a principle or standard by which to evaluate your actions. And then, he makes distinctions between needs and wants, finite, infinite goods. I used to think that it was like the golden mean was the idea that everything in proportion and balance. But actually, he didn't mean that. He meant there's a certain amount of things that you need, like food, shelter, clothing, pleasure, wealth, are finite. Like there comes a point if you have too much of them, it's bad for you.
Yeah, I mean, golden mean doesn't apply to those things anyway. It
Right.
just
Okay.
applies to the virtues,
Right.
which is not a mean, like it's more of just a middle, like the mean of, so there's courage, and there's cowardice, and
Got it here.
there's rashness. And courage is the mean of rashness and cowardice.
Right.
It's in between. And
Right.
not dead center, but somewhere between the two. I mean,
There's
that's the
a
idea of golden mean,
okay. All right. I thought it was something else.
which
So
is a bit cultural based. And that's why it's not necessarily the best foundation, but the thinking seems on the right track. Like you're trying to find, like, you're not saying there's any, well, I'll just say it's interesting actually, but I don't really, the golden mean is really the only weak point of his ethics, I think.
it's I found virtue interesting as well. Apparently, the Latin roots are habit, and he's all about you don't control everything. Like there's a certain amount of good luck you need, for example, maybe to acquire
Yes.
wealth. But if you cultivate good habits, which to him is virtue, that is the thing you control, your character. And the whole goal is
Yes.
to cultivate the kind of traits that will help you lead the good life, which is the life proper to a human. And
Yes.
the means, like food, shelter, clothing are the means to living, and living is a means to the good life or living well, which is the human form of living. And so, man, this is like the same thing. He's just in terms of the virtues, like even his virtues are aimed at living the good life or flourishing. It's just
Yeah.
maybe that he went somewhere wrong with the method you're saying. But like,
Yeah.
I can't see it. If we're looking at it in a big picture sense, I cannot see the difference. This is like objectivist ethics, basically. It's all about pursuing your own, living well for yourself.
Yeah. I'm like your wellness as a human, but yeah, which should be the same as yourself. I mean, yeah, I mean, I could nitpick on things like, I mean, the exact precise thing I think about Aristotle would be like, he's a bit more community, a bit more collectivist than you might, than I think even I would admit sometimes.
Well,
But those are almost like minor errors, is not significant. And the by and large it is objectivism builds on, especially the more concrete, definite, easy to verify things about Aristotle, especially about like the practical nature of ethics, as in like the applying it to our lives in the world as we know it to our unique context, really emphasizing that, which Aristotle did talk a lot about, and that is what he gets right, I think. And he really emphasizes like it's ethics is an art to him. Like it applies to the concrete situations unique to you. Like you're applying this abstract thing to your life or a life or something like that. Almost like a doctor would. Like it's not necessarily, a doctor doesn't tries to heal you as far as like dealing with you as a whole. Like what are you as a human? How do you deal with that? And you could think of ethics in a similar way, that like you can get prescriptions what how to take care of yourself, but there is no singular cure for any issue. You
right.
have to think about it and apply it to the situation.
On the topic of him being more like emphasizing the social and political more, even that, and the author, keep in mind, this author who did this summary is a Christian. He writes about him sort of advocating enlightened self-interest, and in the
Yeah,
politics I was like, even the
for
politics
sure.
is here. He writes this, look at this, is his summary: do others have a right to expect us to act positively to help them in the pursuit of happiness? um so not interfering with, impeding, or obstructing their efforts at living their good life is one thing. So obtain what he calls, Aristotle, or at least Mortimer Adler says Aristotle calls, real goods.
Yeah.
But then helping them obtain real goods is a completely different thing. Have they a right to claim to our help? According to
Yeah.
Aristotle, no. So this is the same thing. It's like the conception of rights is based in the fact that you're a human, which the fact that you're human is your reasoning mind, your ability to ask questions, which is what differentiates you from your animals. So rights are just the judgment on, or it's like a right. So rights, the conception of rights are based on the same thing, based on the reasoning mind. And it's a negative and not a positive. It doesn't say you help other people. And even here, he said this as well. Aristotle says that the good state, basically the end goal of the state, whatever he said actually in detail is one thing, but the end goal is what he was aiming at. Same with the ethics, was that it should serve the happiness of the individuals who compose it. It should promote their pursuing, their living the good life or living well. And so to me, that's also the same. It's like exactly the same. If we're talking big picture, right? Not little tiny details.
Mm-hmm.
No
yeah,
difference.
I think so. Especially keeping in context that there were no mega governments like there are now.
Right.
I mean, Athens was probably like the biggest thing. Well, maybe Carthage may have been bigger there. I don't know. Persia was actually big at the time. But if that's the biggest thing he knows, and most of his life involves like city states, then it especially makes sense. I mean, I wonder what he would say about modern governments and how governments should they serve people now? But
right.
It's interesting how I think he started the development of political science in a way. I think Machiavelli took it over, but even he was influenced by Aristotle. He's really Aristotelian, I would say, in his style of doing science or style of analysis.
How did we deviate so much from this? Because this ethics to me is so common sense. Like it's just so you could almost say, oh, that's obvious. Like someone could. But then how do we end up in like such completely different conceptions of what doing good is or government is?
I think that's what almost Atlas Shrugged is almost explains. Like, wait, in the context, like imagine that taking some things Rand noticed and then extrapolating that into a fiction novel. Like she's almost identifying ways that society has corrupted the human mind, whether it's in terms of like ethics, trying to convince you that you shouldn't be concerned with yourself, or logic, trying to consider that contradictions do exist in reality, or
Right.
that politics should be about duty to your fellow man, and that words don't need to mean anything because they just mean whatever's convenient for you,
Right.
and that there's dependency on other people, that you shouldn't think for yourself. It's a huge interaction of factors that gradually destroy the human mind, that have developed over time. Even education, that kids are not taught to think for themselves. And Rand is almost explaining like each little character, even every scene, almost says something in the way that society tries to demean man's mind and his way of thinking, and all these little things in every facet of your life. And then imagine if that just builds over time, every little facet, each generation of children taught not to think very clearly. It just gradually gets worse and worse and worse at all levels. Not just like, oh, it's bad politics, you fix that. It's an integrated sum of things, a decay of thinking and all levels, from politics to epistemology to ethics. It's not one single thing, but each little thing gets destroyed, gets eroded bit by bit, until eventually you reach like a modern stage where we are like things just get worse and worse. And
good, but sorry, continue.
A lot of what Rand is saying is that he was sanctioned a victim, that at some point we have to say no, acknowledge the evil is only perpetuating because we let it. But at another level, that it can't just be one person. Otherwise, it'd be like Tiananmen Square. Like you stand in front of one tank, great for you, but you get run over, you die, then what? Nothing. There's got to be more than one person taking away their sanction of evil for it to really have an effect. And there's a lot of things like that I think Rand is getting at. Like, I think at some level she has a rage against what has happened to society, that it makes it harder to see the values in life. And even leading a good life is that much harder than it could have been like 2,000 years ago.
This goes back to my question of, I pasted you a little quote from, I don't know if it was Hegel, but it was someone similar to Hegel, and it was just talking about the non-being of non-being, and it was just I don't know, it's so difficult to read it. Like, is like this being puzzled on how that has an influence over something as straightforward, or apparently as
That's
straightforward.
probably
I'm
Hegel.
reading a summary.
Hegel is never straightforward. Even a summary would be confusing.
But that's what I mean. Like, how is it that it's still baffling that I I I do realize I read a summary here, but this was not a summary by an objectivist. This was a summary by a Christian.
Yeah.
And it just seems so logical and straightforward. And then how does that get ignored? It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, how does that get ignored and then Hegel gets picked up? Like, I don't get it. I'm still baffled by it. Even though what you explain is like,
I don't even know enough about Hegel to even say. I don't really know any Hegel.
okay.
So, but I do know that as far as clarity goes, actually, I don't know what my point was. Never mind.
Okay. Let's